The Willow Wren, a fairy tale by the Brothers Grimm. In former days, every sound still had its meaning and application. When the smith's hammer resounded, it cried, "Strike away! Strike away!" When the carpenter's plane grated, it said, "Here goes! Here goes!" If the mill wheel began to clack, it exclaimed, "Help, Lord God! Help, Lord God!" If, however, the miller was a cheat and happened to leave the mill, it spoke in High German, first asking slowly, "Who is there? Who is there?" And then quickly answering, "The miller, the miller." And finally, in a hurry, he steals bravely, 3 pecks in a bushel." At this time, the birds also had their own language that everyone understood. Now it only sounds like chirping, screeching, and whistling, and to some, like music without words. However, the idea came to the birds that they would no longer be without a ruler, and would choose one of themselves to be their king. One bird among them, the green plover, was opposed to this. He had lived free and would die free. Anxiously flying hither and thither, he cried, "Where shall I go? Where shall I go?" He retired into a solitary and unfrequented marsh and showed himself no more among his fellows. The birds now wished to discuss the matter, and on a fine May morning, they all gathered together from the woods and fields. Eagles and chaffinches, owls and crows, larks and sparrows, how can I name them all? Even the cuckoo came, and the hoopoe, his clerk, who is so called because he is always heard a few days before him, and a very small bird, which as yet had no name, mingled with the band. The hen, which by some accident had heard nothing of the whole matter, was astonished at the great assemblage. What is going to be done?" she cackled. But the cock calmed his beloved hen and said, "Only wealthy people," and told her what they had in mind. It was decided, however, that the one who could fly the highest should be king. A tree frog, which was sitting among the bushes, when he heard that, cried a warning. "No, no, no, no," because he thought that many tears would be shed because of this. But the crow said, "Caw, caw," and that all would pass off peaceably. It was now determined that on this fine morning they should at once begin to ascend, so that hereafter no one should be able to say, "I could easily have flown much higher, but the evening came on, and I could do no more." On a given signal, therefore, the whole troop rose up in the air, the dust ascended from the land, and there was tremendous fluttering and whirring and beating of wings, and it looked as if a black cloud was rising up. However, the little birds were soon left behind. They could go no farther and fell back to the ground. The larger birds held out longer, but none could equal the eagle, who mounted so high that he could have picked the eyes out of the sun. When he saw that the others could not get up to him, he thought, "Why shouldst thou fly still higher? Thou art the king," and began to let himself down again. The birds beneath him at once cried to him, "Thou must be our king. No one has flown so high as thou." "Except me," screamed the little fellow without a name, who had crept into the breast feathers of the eagle. And as he was not at all tired, he rose up and mounted so high that he reached heaven itself. When, however, he had gone as far as this, he folded his wings together and called down with clear and penetrating voice, "I am king! I am king!" "Thou art king?" cried the birds angrily. "Thou hast achieved it through trickery and cunning." Consequently, they set another condition. He should be king who could go lowest into the ground. How the goose flapped about with its broad breast when it returned to land! How quickly the rooster scratched a hole! The duck fared the worst of all, as she jumped into a ditch, sprained her legs, and waddled away to a neighboring pond, crying, "Cheating! Cheating!" However, the little bird without a name sought out a mouse hole, slipped into it, and cried from within with his small voice, "I am king! I am king!" "Thou art king!" cried the birds even more angrily. "Do you think your cunning will prevail?" They decided to keep him imprisoned in the hole and starve him out. The owl was placed as a sentinel in front of it, under threat to her life not to let the rascal escape. When evening came, all the birds were very tired from exerting their wings so much, so they went to bed with their mates and chicks. Only the owl remained standing by the mouse hole, gazing steadfastly into it with her large eyes. Eventually, she too grew tired and thought to herself, "You can certainly close one eye. You'll still watch with the other, and the little miscreant won't come out of his hole." So she shut one eye and kept the other fixed on the mouse hole. The little fellow peeked out and wanted to slip away, but the owl immediately advanced, causing him to retreat. Then the owl opened the one eye again and shut the other, intending to alternate through the night. However, when she next shut one eye, she forgot to reopen the other, and as soon as both her eyes were shut, she fell asleep. The little fellow soon noticed this and slipped away. From that day forth, the owl has never dared to show herself by daylight, for if she does, the other birds chase her and pluck her feathers out. She only flies out by night, but harbors a strong dislike for mice, whom she pursues because they make such unsightly holes. The little bird is also reluctant to reveal himself, fearing it may cost him his life if caught. He stealthily moves about in the hedges and, when entirely safe, sometimes proclaims, "I am king," prompting the other birds to mockingly dub him King of the Hedges, Zaunkönig. However, no bird is happier than the lark, who rejoices in not having to obey the little king. As soon as the sun appears, she soars high into the sky and sings, "Ah, how beautiful that is! Beautiful that is! Beautiful, beautiful! Ah, how beautiful that is!" The Soul, a Fairy Tale by the Brothers Grimm. The fishes had long been discontented because no order prevailed in their kingdom. None of them turned aside for the others. All swam to the right or the left as they fancied, darting between those who wanted to stay together or getting in their way. A strong one would give a weak one a blow with its tail, driving it away, or swallowing it up without more ado. How delightful it would be, they said, if we had a king who enforced law and justice among us. They met together to choose as their ruler the one who could cleave through the water most quickly and give help to the weak ones. They placed themselves in rank and file by the shore, and the pike gave the signal with his tail, at which they all started. Like an arrow, the pike darted away, and with him the herring, the gudgeon, the perch, the carp, and all the rest. Even the sole swam with them, hoping to reach the winning place. All at once, the cry was heard, "The herring is first!" "Who is first?" screamed the flat, envious sole, who had been left far behind. "Who is first?" The herring," was the answer. "The naked herring?" cried the jealous creature. "The naked herring." Since that time, the sole's mouth has been at one side as punishment. The Bittern and the Hoopoe, a fairy tale by the Brothers Grimm. "Where do you like best to feed your flocks?" asked a man to an old cowherd. "Here, sir, where the grass is neither too rich nor too poor, or else it is no use." "Why not?" asked the man. "Do you hear that melancholy cry from the meadow there?" answered the shepherd. "That is the bittern. He was once a shepherd, and so was the hoopoe. I will tell you the story. The bittern pastured his flocks on rich green meadows where flowers grew in abundance, so his cows became wild and unmanageable. The hoopoe drove his cattle onto high barren hills, where the wind plays with the sand, and his cows became thin and got no strength. When it was evening, and the shepherds wanted to drive their cows homewards, the bittern could not get his together again. They were too high-spirited and ran away from him. He called, "Come, cows, come!" But it was of no use. They took no notice of his calling. Meanwhile, the hoopoe could not even get his cows up on their legs, so faint and weak had they become. "Up, up, up!" screamed he, but it was in vain. They remained lying on the sand. That is the way when one has no moderation. To this day, though they have no flocks now to watch, the bittern cries, "Come, cows, come!" and the hoopoe, "Up, up, up!" The Owl, a Fairy Tale by the Brothers Grimm. 200 or 300 years ago, when people were far from being as crafty and cunning as they are nowadays, an extraordinary event took place in a little town. By some mischance, one of the great owls, called horned owls, had come from the neighboring woods into the barn of one of the townsfolk during the night. And when day broke, it did not dare to venture forth again from her retreat for fear of the other birds, which raised a terrible outcry whenever she appeared. In the morning, when the manservant went into the barn to fetch some straw, he was so mightily alarmed at the sight of the owl sitting there in a corner that he ran away and announced to his master that a monster, the like of which he had never set eyes on in his life, and which could devour a man without the slightest difficulty, was sitting in the barn, rolling its eyes about in its head. "I know you already," said the master. "You have courage enough to chase a blackbird about the fields, but when you see a dead hen lying, you need a stick before you go near it. I must go and see for myself what kind of monster it is, added the master, and went quite boldly into the granary and looked around him. However, when he saw the strange, grim creature with his own eyes, he was no less terrified than the servant had been. With 2 bounds, he sprang out, ran to his neighbors, and begged them imploringly to lend him assistance against an unknown and dangerous beast, or else the whole town might be in danger if it were to break loose out of the barn where it was shut up. A great noise and clamor arose in all the streets, and the townsmen came armed with spears, hayforks, scythes, and axes, as if they were going out against an enemy. Finally, the senators appeared with the burgomaster at their head. When they had drawn up in the marketplace, they marched to the barn and surrounded it on all sides. One of the most courageous of them then stepped forth and entered with his spear lowered, but came running out immediately afterward with a shriek and as pale as death, and could not utter a single word. 2 others ventured in, but they fared no better. At last, one stepped forth, a great strong man who was famous for his warlike deeds. He said, "You will not drive away the monster by merely looking at him. We must be in earnest here. However, I see that you have all turned into women, and not one of you dares to encounter the animal." He ordered them to give him some armor, had a sword and spear brought, and armed himself. All praised his courage, though many feared for his life. The 2 barn doors were opened, and they saw the owl, which in the meantime had perched herself on the middle of a great crossbeam. He had a ladder brought, and when he raised it and made ready to climb up, they all cried out to him to bear himself bravely and commended him to St. George, who slew the dragon. When he had just got to the top, the owl perceived that he had designs on her. Bewildered by the crowd and the shouting, and knowing not how to escape, she rolled her eyes, ruffled her feathers, flapped her wings, snapped her beak, and cried, "Tu-wit, tu-woo," in a harsh voice. "Strike home! Strike home!" screamed the crowd outside to the valiant hero. "Anyone who was standing where I am standing," he answered, "would not cry, 'Strike home!'" He certainly did plant his foot 1 rung higher on the ladder. Then he began to tremble and, half fainting, went back again. Now there was no one left who dared to put himself in such danger. "The monster," they said, "has poisoned and mortally wounded the very strongest man among us by snapping at him and just breathing on him. Are we, too, to risk our lives?" They took counsel as to what they ought to do to prevent the whole town from being destroyed. For a long time, everything seemed to be of no use. At length, the burgomaster found an expedient. "My opinion," he said, "is that we ought, out of the common purse, to pay for this barn, and whatsoever corn, straw, or hay it contains, and thus indemnify the owner. Then burn down the whole building, and the terrible beast with it. Thus no one will have to endanger his life. This is no time for thinking of expense, and niggardliness would be ill applied." All agreed with him. So they set fire to the barn at all 4 corners, and with it the owl was miserably burnt. Let anyone who will not believe it go thither and inquire for himself. The Moon, a Fairy Tale by the Brothers Grimm. In days gone by, there was a land where the nights were always dark, and the sky spread over it like a black cloth, for there the moon never rose, and no star shone in the obscurity. At the creation of the world, the light at night had been sufficient. 4 young fellows once left this country on a traveling expedition and arrived in another kingdom, where in the evening, when the sun had disappeared behind the mountains, a shining globe was placed on an oak tree, shedding a soft light far and wide. By means of this, everything could be well seen and distinguished, even though it was not as brilliant as the sun. The travelers stopped and asked a countryman who was driving past with his cart what kind of light that was. "That is the moon," he answered. "Our mayor bought it for 3 thalers and fastened it to the oak tree. He has to pour oil into it daily and keep it clean so that it may always burn clearly. He receives 1 thaler a week from us for doing it." When the countrymen had driven away, one of them said, "We could make use of this lamp. We have an oak tree at home, which is just as big as this, and we could hang it on that. What a pleasure it would be not to have to feel about at night in the darkness." The second said, "I'll tell you what we'll do. We will fetch a cart and horses and carry away the moon. The people here can buy themselves another." The third said, "I'm a good climber. I will bring it down. The fourth brought a cart and horses, and the third climbed the tree, bored a hole in the moon, passed a rope through it, and let it down. When the shining ball lay in the cart, they covered it with a cloth so that no one would observe the theft. They conveyed it safely to their own country and placed it on a high oak. Old and young rejoiced when the new lamp let its light shine over the whole land, filling bedrooms and sitting rooms. The dwarfs came forth from their caves in the rocks, and the tiny elves, in their little red coats, danced in rings on the meadows. The four took care that the moon was provided with oil, cleaned the wick, and received their weekly thaler. They became old men, and when one of them grew ill and saw that he was about to die, he appointed that 1/4 of the moon should, as his property, be laid in the grave with him. When he died, the mayor climbed up the tree, cut off 1/4 with the hedge shears, and placed it in his coffin. The light of the moon decreased, but still not visibly. When the second died, the second 1/4 was buried with him, and the light diminished. It grew weaker still after the death of the third, who likewise took his part of it away with him. When the fourth was borne to his grave, the old state of darkness recommenced, and whenever the people went out at night without their lanterns, they knocked their heads together. However, when the pieces of the moon united themselves together again in the world below, where darkness had always prevailed, the dead became restless and awoke from their sleep. They were astonished when they were able to see again. The moonlight was quite sufficient for them, for their eyes had become so weak that they could not have borne the brilliance of the sun. They rose up, were merry, and fell into their former ways of living. Some went to play and dance, while others hastened to the public houses, where they asked for wine, got drunk, brawled, quarreled, and at last took up cudgels and belabored each other. The noise became greater and greater, and at last reached even to heaven. St. Peter, who guards the gate of heaven, thought the lower world had broken out in revolt and gathered together the heavenly troops, which are to drive back the evil one when he and his associates storm the abode of the blessed. Since they did not come, he got on his horse and rode through the gate of heaven down into the world below. There he subdued the dead, bade them lie down in their graves again, took the moon away with him, and hung it up in heaven.